Ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America!
And now, ladies and gentlemen, your host, Tim Binnall.
No commercials, no subscriptions, no network, no rules, and at the end of the day, my friends, no comparison. Welcome to another edition of BOA The Revival. Really looking forward to this program this week, my friends. It's going to be a really fun conversation, I think. Our guest is Gabriel Mckee. He is the librarian for collections and services at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. He's also the co-editor of Theology and the DC Universe, and his prior works include The Gospel According to Science Fiction, Pink Beams of Light from the God in the Gutter, and Evermore, The Persistence of Poe. But what we're going to be talking about tonight, fittingly, appropriately, on Binnall of America here, is his new book that just came out this spring. It is, and we don't even use the video, but I like to show it anyway that I have it, and I've actually read it. Finished it this morning for just a few hours ago, so it's super fresh with me. Talking about the Saucerian, UFOs, Men in Black, and the unbelievable life of Gray Barker. Gabriel Mckee, thank you so much for coming on the show. I use this superlative sparingly when I read a fantastic book, but this is a tour de force. I absolutely loved this book so much. I just devoured it, and I ran into a problem that I often have when I read these books, where it's like I try to take pretty good notes, and I have them over here, like you can kind of see them. But at some point, I kind of lose myself in the book, and then I look at the notes, and I'm like, wait a minute, the last note was like 45 pages ago. What are you doing? What are you doing? And I kind of like try to fill it in with stuff that, because I'm so into the book that I stopped taking notes. It's tremendous, and hats off to you. As I said, an absolute tour de force. And with all that, thank you for coming on Binnall of America to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Now, we always start out with the first-time guest, the bio, the background, who is, I gave sort of the thumbnail there, but who is Gabriel Mckee, and how did you wind up doing this book on Gray Barker? Because it's, it's completely kind of a little bit out of left field. It's like some of your stuff, DC and science fiction. So it's sort of like in the realm, but it's a biography of quite a character from the world of flying saucers, from the classic world of flying saucers. It's a real sort of niche character. So how did you come upon that?
For sure.
And who is Gabriel Mckee?
Yeah, so I have a background in the study of religion and theology. I went to divinity school, got a master's degree back in 2000. And after that, I went ahead and got a library degree and kind of specialized a bit in rare books and archives. So I've done some of my scholarship is on science fiction and religion. That was kind of my entry point into both of those subjects, was the author Philip K. Dick, who is a great, if weird, starting point for both religion and science fiction. Then in my previous job to this one of my tasks was creating an inventory of the UFO library of Jack Womack, who is an author interested in Forteana and winner of the Philip K. Dick Award for his novel Elvisy back in the 90s. And he's also a legendary book collector. So he had this astounding collection of UFO books that he was looking to place into an institutional collection. So my job was to inventory it and to select highlights that were going to go into an exhibition, and a book that was eventually published in 2016 called Flying Saucers Are Real, which I'm a credited co-editor of. And as I was going through that collection, I noticed that the weirdest books in there, both in terms of content and bibliography, because they were just kind of weirdly formatted, all had this Clarksburg, West Virginia imprint. And the books with the best titles were all by this guy named Gray Barker. So They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, I think, is one of the all-time great book titles in any genre.
Okay.
So that got me started just on kind of figuring out, like, where did these books come from? How did they get made? And realizing that Gray Barker was, even more interesting as an individual than the books were as literature and as objects. So that was really what kind of got me on this particular train car on this crazy track. So.
Yeah, well, he's really quite the character, and I sort of I fancy myself a student of flying saucers and UFO history. I certainly know more than 95% of the population. Yeah, the people who are listening to the show, I'm sure there's many of them. And I mentioned before we went on the air, my dear friend Aaron Goulias, I consider him probably the best UFO historian, quite frankly, because he has the best perspective on this. He has sort of a detached perspective who can kind of see the humor in it, which I really appreciate. So I lean on him when I want to get into the details. But I had not really sort of understood the impact of Barker. And what I like about the book is it takes you obviously through his life and sort of gives you a taste of sort of what this little clique was, this fiefdom, this sort of group of people that were driving all this as it unfolded like in the 50s and 60s. Now, before we sort of dive into the life of Barker, what's really remarkable, and I'm sure that you leaned on it, is the archive down in Clarksburg. I mean, there's not many of these folks who have these sort of like collections, if you will, where you can go, and it sounded like, especially because of the time period, that was how all the communication was done. So you can really kind of peer in and be an observer and an eavesdropper on all these guys and gals as they're, talking about, meddling with this field and growing this field and sort of, you can get into the melting pot, if you will.
Yeah, the archive is 100% what made this book even possible. So Barker's archive is at the historic Waldemore, which is a West Virginia regional history center attached to the Clarksburg Harrison Public Library. And they've had since, I think they acquired it in the early 90s. They've had Barker's archive. And for a couple decades, that was just a room with some file cabinets in it. During a renovation a couple of years ago, they kind of professionalized their storage a bit and got them into like nicer, slightly more archival storage. But it's organized the way Barker organized it. It's his folders. And so there's one drawer that's just folders labeled Crackpot 1, Crackpot 2, all the way up to 8 or 9, I think. So he saved everything that was sent to him. He kept carbons of most of the letters that he sends out. And so you can really get a very complete picture of his life and career from, I would say, the late 40s through the early 70s. I think his record-keeping practices did drop off a bit after that. And so you'll see the last 15 years of his life are a bit slimmer section of the book than the earlier part. But also the part that most people are interested in is kind of the earliest part of his saucer career, I think. So gets a justifiable number of pages in the bio. But yeah, so that made, doing this book possible. So I've made a couple trips there, just basically digitizing tens of thousands of documents that they have there. And even then only scratching the surface of what's available there because it is massive. And so, my most recent trip there in May, so after the book was out, I was still finding stuff that, some of it I'm sad that I wasn't able to include in the book. Some I'm kind of glad that I didn't have, so I didn't make choices. I found, for example, some documents of his psychiatrist visits in the 60s.
Oh, wow.
Which is like, this is, I don't know that I should be looking at this, but here it is.
Oh, wow.
Not having to make the decision about whether to include that in the book was maybe.
You lucked out there. Yeah, it's really, it's remarkable. I've talked about this with people, archivist type historian folks on the show recently and previously. There it's like, it's just kind of crazy, not to get off too much on a tangent, but sort of like in this digital world, you know, like when I go and other people go, like your emails don't get saved. Like it's not really, they pretty much like vanish. So it's like I have emails from Art Bell and Stan Friedman and Jim Morris, like scheduling shows or working for Coast to Coast with, setting up something for art for the website or whatever. And it's just like, that shit's going to go. That's going to be vanish when I'm gone. It's like, that's kind of crazy in a way. We're going to reach a point where there's a dark ages of information because the stuff was all digital.
And well, even for the earlier period, I think 99% of the figures in the UFO world, their archives didn't get saved. Or what did get saved is like their clippings, their UFO, but not necessarily their personal correspondence, which for somebody looking at the history of the field is, maybe more interesting than, yet another clipping about the Wanakee Reservoir or something.
Yeah. So we'll take this sort of chronologically. I'm not going to sometimes I'm going to get you on a very specific thing from the book. Hopefully it doesn't throw you too much, but most of the time it's kind of a little bit broad, and I may just set you up with talk about this. But we'll proceed with caution. So here's what struck me at the very beginning of the book, as we get into Parker's life, and a very specific sort of moment in a sense. It was when he's in college and he's in charge of this thing, the Chamber of Horrors, and it's like a Halloween party, and it's this elaborate thing with all these different sort of accoutrements and attractions and stuff. It's like, oh my God, this guy was, and it's borne out throughout the book. This guy was like a natural born hustler. He was just always kind of working it. He was always, and he had a lot of irons in the fire, and he was sort of it just seemed like he had boundless energy sort of to be this sort of entertainer, to be this sort of presenter kind of individual. And you can see it right from the very beginning there with the Chamber of Horrors, and it sort of goes out throughout his career.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of glad you latched onto that Chamber of Horrors thing, because I think it is a really great early picture of what he wanted his life to be. I think he, was, for the college Halloween party, and he set up, Tesla coils and, dripping witch's brew and weird sound effects. And he made this entire environment for people to go in and have a scary good time. And I think that is entirely what he was doing with his writing and with his publishing as well, was, creating a scary good time for not a small local audience of people at his college, but for a really broad national and even international audience of people who are into UFOs. And if you'll also see it, in hearing interviews with his nieces and nephews talking about what a great teller of ghost stories he was. And I think it's all different facets of the exact same thing, that he's telling stories to give people a thrill.
Yeah. It was quite the picture. I'm just like, how does this guy, it's hard to even put your mind in that sort of period of time and everything. It's like, I guess when people don't have phones and everything, they're just kind of, but they're not, that people had more wholesome fun in a sense. Now we could spend like the whole show talking about Albert Bender and the Men in Black thing. But I guess what I'm wondering is and maybe you're kind of the same way, but it's like, I still can't quite wrap my head around what like the fuck happened there. Like, what did this guy just have a mental breakdown? Did he just drop out? He was just like fed up with all this, because it seems like, all the friends were trying to figure it out. And that was kind of illuminating to me reading the book. Cause it was like, okay, so they weren't necessarily in on whatever cover story he was coming up with to bail on flying saucers. Like, they were all as flummoxed as anyone about one day. He's just like, yeah, I'm out. So we really don't know, do we, exactly what went down?
We don't know. And the big grain of salt that you need in any attempt to figure out, what any actual historical event surrounding Albert K. Bender in the fall of 1953 might have been, is that any version of the story that you're going to be reading is a version that's been filtered through Barker. Right. There are a couple very minor exceptions to that. but they're pretty brief and don't have a lot of detail. There was one newspaper report that like preceded Barker in the local Bridgeport paper, but then Barker published it. So the version of it that I've read is in a Saucerian publication. So I think that still counts as being filtered. But yeah, you're not going to get the answer, and that's maddening for some people. For Barker, I think it was kind of thrilling. And it created this an opportunity, I think, for him to introduce speculation and get people talking to each other, which is really, I think, what he wanted to do through a lot of his publishing activities, was to, I'm going to tell you a story, but now I want you to go and tell each other the story too. And that ends up there's a feedback loop where he then starts getting reports and then he publishes those reports. And so he kind of created something self-sustaining with that. But yeah, theories abound. And Barker's own ideas about it would change. So at one point in the late 50s, I think, he wrote to somebody and said, if you and I had been there in the room when Bender had his visit from the three men, we would not have seen anything. So basically saying,
interesting.
But he didn't necessarily mean that it was, a delusion or a hallucination or something when he said that. What he was actually saying was, this is in the context of talking about Mead Lane and the Borderland Sciences Research Associates, and saying it may have been taking place on the astral plane. But you can believe that? I don't think so. So he presents that theory in a context that can be interpreted in a couple different ways, as this is still something amazing, or this is just something delusional. I don't think there's an answer to what happened. I do know David Halperin, in his book Intimate Alien, which is great, came out just a few years ago, does have a kind of detailed theory about the Air Force. It's fine. I think it's as plausible as anything. Cora Lorenzen had received an actual Air Force visit earlier in the same year, and he's basically saying, this is probably Air Force intelligence. Yeah, maybe it was. I don't know, but that's not what it became in myth and storytelling. It became something much more nebulous and fun, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you actually mentioned one of those finer little points, because you mentioned that Gray was kind of unhappy that Bender didn't give him the story, but it was it just seemed odd to me that some random local newspaper would get this story, would be the first to write this story about this guy being visited and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and Barker was pissed about that. He said, because Bender had told him, don't say anything about this for now.
Yeah.
And so he was like, great. He took that as meaning I'm going to let you break this story when the time is right. But it's not now. So yeah, then he was really upset when he saw that Bender had spoken to the Bridgeport newspaper. I don't know what Bender's reason for doing that was. It may have just been that rumors were circulating locally and he felt like he had to do something. I don't know if he knew the newspaper reporter personally. It's not too huge a town. But then the who gets to control the story is something that becomes really contentious over the next few months. Because Bender kind of wants it to be, he just basically wants it to go away. And Barker and Dominic Lucchesi, want to get to the bottom of it. And then within a couple of years, you see August Roberts writing, who had kind of also thought that he was going to be the guy to get to write this up, had a long correspondence with Bender. In one of his letters, he said, I'm going to write my Bender story, whether you like it or not. And so claiming, you're writing to Bender and saying, this is my Bender story. I think that's a really, really telling line. Control of that story is a really interesting thread.
Interesting. Now, I was really surprised. We'll circle back, but to skip ahead a little chronologically. So Bender shows up again 10 years later, and that was a surprise to me. Yeah. And I'm like, what? Where did this guy? He's coming back. And then it got all weird because he's trying to tell the story, and it's a completely sort of different version of the story. And as you mentioned, what I noticed, I'm going to kind of mention a bunch of stuff. Feel free to just jump anywhere in after I push your boat into the lake. when I noticed it, not just with Bender when he came back, but with many other people who brought their books to Gray Barker to be published, he fucking just was changing all kinds of shit. And I'm like, every time that happened, I'm like, oh, dude, this guy's kind of, he's really going, I don't know how I feel about this. This guy's kind of nuts. He just keeps changing everybody's book. And some of them, they were like wholesale rewrites. And other times he changed like the messages of the book. And it was like, this isn't like he's just changing the grammar. He's like ghost writing. He's taking that as a rough draft and then putting it through the Bender blender, if you will, and making it into his sort of vision. So I guess just talk about not the Bender blender, the Barker blender, but just talk about sort of Bender coming back into the scene, and maybe how that might have upset sort of Barker's telling of his story, and then just Barker's penchant for like meddling with people's books when they sent them to be published.
It is the Barker blender, but I really like Bender blender.
I know, that's
great. That's a good
rhyme. That's why my mind went there. The rhyme, yeah.
So I think it was as much a surprise to Barker as to anybody else when in late 1961, Bender sends him a manuscript. It's like, the time that they told me to wait for has passed, and now I'm going to tell the story of the three men.
Now let me stop you. Was he in contact with these guys, or was this completely out of the blue? They're like, where have you been, dude? Was it like that?
As far as I know, there had really not been any correspondence between the two of them for a few years at that point.
Okay.
One unfortunate fact about the way the archive had been stored in Clarksburg through the 90s was that it wasn't super secure. And some of the best stuff may have gone missing in that period. And one of the folders that you'd expect to find that simply isn't there or is very thin is the folder of Barker Bender correspondence. So whoever took it, shame on you. There's also please return it to Clarksburg for posterity. This happened decades ago, but yeah, so it's unfortunate. But in any event, I don't think there was really any correspondence between them, and certainly Barker presented it as this arrived without any preamble. It was just a manuscript he received in the mail. Now, one big caveat with all of this is we don't have Bender's manuscript. It is at least not anywhere that I have been able to find in the Barker archive. We do have full manuscripts of other books. So like Howard Menger's From Outer Space to You, we've got Menger's manuscript that he sent in. So you can really compare them side by side with the published version and see what the differences are. And I had a lot of fun doing that with the Menger book, just basically going line by line through and seeing just how much he changed, but also how much he didn't change. There were some kind of surprising things. So you're right that he did do a lot of rewriting. But he was really, for the most part, kind of trying to finesse it into something that was going to be readable. Menger's manuscript as sent in was not good.
I can imagine.
Unreadable book. And I think the version that Barker published is pretty good. It's got some really nice kind of poetic moments. I'm pretty sure Barker wrote the best stuff. But he's kind of trying to create a spirit for the story to kind of be animated by. So you'll hear a lot of different things of people saying, oh, well, Barker completely rewrote Bender's manuscript, or it's entirely Barker's work and Bender didn't write a word of it. And we simply don't know. And so I believe that he was being honest, that he received something from Bender. And that he worked it into what he produced. But there are differences between the version of the story that Bender told in the 50s, the version he told in 1962, and that audio recording, The World of Kayak, that he had recorded for one of the UFO conventions in the 60s, which Aaron Gullius did an episode of the Saucer Life on as well.
Oh yeah, I've heard that many times.
In that audio recording that don't appear in the book. The kind of weirdest thing is the World Contact Day experience, where Bender's like, I got all the IFSB members together. We picked a date and we were all going to send a psychic message at the same time. The only source for that story I found is in the 1962 book. I found nothing from the 50s indicating that this had happened, including Barker's timeline of events from back then. So I think that was something that got invented for this book in 1962. There are people who still celebrate World Contact Day, and the message got turned into that song by the Carpenters in the 70s, which is my favorite footnote in the book to write. But yeah, so Barker then publishes, Flying Saucers and the Three Men as being by Albert K. Bender with annotations by Gray Barker, and there are a few footnotes throughout the book that he's claiming authorship of. Other parts of the story that he may have written, we don't know. But I think there's a very good chance he jazzed up the manuscript. Because it's a fun read, that book. And generally, if a book that Barker published is fun to read, I think there's a good chance he rewrote it. If it's dull as dirt, he probably didn't. And there are things that he would pick up off the slush pile and print as is.
Yeah. Well, I totally see where you're coming from. I hadn't really given it much thought, but when you say that too, it's like these folks then, today, in the UFO world, these aren't like necessarily like trained writers, and many of them feel compelled to write a book. And nowadays, where you can just go on Amazon and publish it yourself, some of them are like awful, terrible, like just unreadable. And it's so I can totally see where he sort of served as a conduit to take these folks' raw ideas, stories, recollections, narratives, and then polish them to actually something you can read.
Yeah. And a lot of the people from this period that are remembered as, the most important, the most influential, they're the ones who were good writers. Like Donald Kehoe could spin a tale. His books are compelling. They're like novels. John Keel is an outstanding writer. But they also all play with the truth in a lot of the ways that Barker was playing with. The idea that to be kind of absorbed by the community as fact, something has to be presented in the context of an enjoyable narrative. And that, I think, is kind of the piece of Barker's influence that's the hardest to nail down. Because I think the mere fact that you have a UFO community that exists after the late 50s is in large part because of Barker and a couple other people like him who were really good at storytelling and were able to kind of keep things going, keep the audience interested. I think if you didn't have those good writers, then this becomes something that kind of fizzles after the early mid 50s.
Right. Well, I thought it was really interesting too, discovering all this as I was reading the Saucerian. The royal you, I don't know. The people, in my mind, you always kind of connect Bender and Barker, obviously, because of the Men in Black and everything. But really, kind of what I picked up from reading the book is that there's a much richer connection between Barker and Jim Moseley. Like that was, if I don't imagine you've heard from Netflix yet, but if there was a limited series to be made out of this book, it would be Barker and Moseley. It seemed like they were like the McCartney and Lennon of sort of this absurdist UFO, vein, if you will, in the flying saucer world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would use maybe a Public Enemy analogy. There you go. With Jim Moseley as Chuck D and Gray Barker as Flavor Flav. But yeah, they were very much a pair. And a lot of the stuff that I got kind of outside of the archive is from Jim Moseley's memoir, Shockingly Close to the Truth, which is as prior to now was as close to a biography of Barker as we had, because he's really interested in telling what he knew of Barker's story as well as his own. They were when they first met, they were a little skeptical of each other. But after maybe a couple times drinking together, they really got to know each other and remained best friends, through the rest of Barker's life. And Moseley, I think, after Barker died, really saw one of his missions in life as kind of preserving Barker's memory and legacy. And I think his book was a big part of that, as well as he was always publishing stuff about Barker in Saucer Smear, until the end.
Yeah. Well, it was what I found really amusing and fun was, and it was shtick, but it was like people didn't know because it was a different time. They like fabricated this faux feud where they kind of like people. I presumably people thought they really didn't like each other.
Yeah.
Really, and it's all like sort of playing out in their respective zines, right? They're kind of like, because that was like the social media of the time. That was where people saw this. They don't know that these guys are calling each other on the phone and like laughing about it.
Yeah, and this is actually great. So earlier this year, I had the pleasure of speaking to Gene Steinberg, who now hosts the Paracast, and it was right before I was going to go to West Virginia. So I told him, like, I'll find, if there's a Gene Steinberg folder, I'll find it and scan it all for you. So I did. And I found it wasn't the first letter, but it was maybe the second or third that Gene had written to Gray Barker. And he was trying to figure out, why did you say something nice about Jim Moseley on the phone when, you hate him in print? So he was like, he thought the feud was real. On the back of the note, on the back of the letter, in Jim Moseley's handwriting is, "This is great. Keep this guy going." So yeah, that was a fantastic little piece of history, and that's something that I was, from Gene's own past that I was able to share with him, because he'd seen the letter, but he had not seen what Jim Moseley wrote on the back of the letter.
That's fantastic. And so what I kind of gleaned from this friendship, in a sense, too, especially at the early part, where they each had their respective zines, newsletters, whatever, because they both had a penchant for hoaxing, it struck me as interesting. Sort of, they created this sort of narrative feedback loop where one would like make up some bullshit story, and the other one would kind of feed off of that. It was almost seemed improvisational, and they would feed off of that, and then it would kind of go back and forth. It was like this circular content farm, if you will, to use it in modern terms, for each other to keep, we need something for the thing next month. What are we going to do? And they kind of, okay, let's cook up some crazy story.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. When I figured out when Barker's hoaxes seemed to ramp up was when he launched his Chasing the Flying Saucers column for Ray Palmer's Flying Saucers magazine, because he had a monthly deadline now. He couldn't wait for the news to arrive. He needed to have like a story ready to go, and that's when you start to see him and Jim Moseley making prank calls to Laura Mundo and Cora Lorenzen, and then you see them publishing those stories in their zines. But then you might also see Laura Mundo publishing the story. So with that one prank call in particular, Barker's reporting on it is not "this happened." It's Laura Mundo's newsletter said.
Right. Yes. So
planting the seeds so he can harvest the fruit later on. And Laura Mundo didn't believe it. She knew something weird was going on. But he kind of shapes how he's going to present what she's writing to say, like,
right.
Similar things have happened elsewhere. It's like, yeah, you made those phone calls too.
Yeah, exactly. It was really cool in a way. I'm a trickster myself. I'm sort of an absurdist with this stuff. So I really grew to love Ray Barker and Jim Moseley over the course of the book, because I'm just like, oh, these guys are rascals, man. They're rascals, yeah. And that's what I like about them. Let's talk about the Straight letter, because this was remarkable in a sense, because this is one of the times where the hoax kind of seemed like it got out of control. How much do we really know that Barker was like, was he really being investigated for this phony letter that he sent to one of the name escapes me, you'll remember, but one of the UFO researchers?
Yeah, so it was late 1957, and Moseley and Barker wrote a fake letter on State Department letterhead to George Adamski, so the first flying saucer contactee, really brilliantly worded letter saying, we can't say anything publicly, but we want you to know privately that there are people in the government who support your work. And this was red meat for George Adamski, so he published it in his own newsletter. It was one of about 7 hoax letters that they wrote in a single weekend, but it's the only one that kind of made any headway anywhere. But because it got kind of publicized a bit first by George Adamski and then in other saucer zines, it did come to the attention of the government. And what I was able to determine, and I determined some of this after the book was published, but there was in fact a State Department investigation. It was an internal investigation. They wanted to know who gave these guys our letterhead.
Right. Yeah.
But because it was circulating in the saucer zines, the State Department and the FBI were getting peppered with letters from a few of the kind of more loquacious people in the saucer world with theories. And one of them is, I think this was Gray Barker. But that gets drowned out by three other, basically the saucer world created the plausible deniability that if someone is telling us that's Gray Barker, well, this is just another crackpot sending letters to the FBI. So the State Department at some point did seem to turn this investigation over to the Justice Department, which would be the FBI that would do that investigation. Barker says that the FBI visited his office. When I was writing the book, I believe that was maybe bluster, that he was just trying to make himself look like somebody who would be important enough to be investigated by the FBI, and it was maybe actually the State Department. But I did find, some FOIA documents from the State Department saying we have turned this over to the Justice Department. No one's ever been able to turn up anything from the FBI. The details of their investigation. And what I think is most likely is that the parent of the person they got the letterhead from, who was a minor, and who was a person attached to the State Department, said, this is embarrassing for the State Department, but it's also embarrassing for my kid personally, and I don't want their life to be messed up. So please, let's just drop this. So that's my best guess as to
that's a great theory. Yeah, I could totally. Yeah, that's how things work. Where it's like, look, my kid stole the thing. Let's just let this
it's go not going to happen again.
yeah, exactly. Now, one of the recurring sort of elements to the book and Barker's life was his homosexuality. Now, how open was he with his fellow researchers? Because I kind of was trying to wrap my mind around that. Seems like you mentioned him and Mosley exchanging letters. I forget the name of the street that he lived on, but it was sort of like this pastiche, this sort of back and forth like narrative, like a telenovela that they were just writing to each other about his exploits, but all in sort of language, which is probably Mosley understood. But how out was he to the rest of the community?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, because I've heard people just say kind of, just assuming, well, he was a closeted gay man. And I have to pause and question, how closeted was he really? So he was definitely out to Jim Mosley, who was his closest friend. But he was also, and this is also, recent stuff I've uncovered, he was also out to John G. Robinson, who was an associate of Mosley's, somebody else in the saucer world. Based on comments that she made, we know that Cora Lorenzen knew that he was gay. They weren't friends. They did not get along. Him being gay might have been part of the reason that they didn't get along, because she was a bit homophobic herself based on those comments.
Oh boy,
that's somebody who's not in his inner circle, who he maybe was out to. He was in a fairly long-term relationship with another man, Don Lee McCulty. They went on vacations together and were ultimately arrested and tried together in the early 60s. And based on things I've heard from people that knew Don, he was not keeping his sexuality a secret. Yeah. And the fact that the two of them were living together, I think there were probably people in Clarksburg who had figured it out, even if he didn't know them personally or didn't know them well. Yeah. And so I'm not entirely sure that he was as closeted as we assume. And one of the kind of most interesting pieces of evidence is from the archive is a letter that he wrote to One magazine, which was essentially this really pioneering gay rights magazine in the 50s that was published in Los Angeles. And he was a subscriber to that magazine within the first year of its publication. And this was a magazine that in the early 50s was, pushing for gay marriage and things like that, and viewing the gay community as a political class that should be be fighting for its rights. So the fact that he was a subscriber to that magazine, I think, is really kind of a compelling piece of evidence. So I think he was. Not necessarily as out as we assume. And also his life, his correspondence offers kind of really great proof of the existence of a vibrant gay community in West Virginia in the 50s. Not a place you would necessarily expect to find one. And I think it's just kind of a fascinating piece of history that he kind of peels back the cover on a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I kind of, my sort of guess, I guess you could say, or interpretation was maybe it was sort of just thought of in a euphemism where it was just like, yeah, Gray's a committed bachelor, like kind of how it was back in the day. It was sort of like people knew, but it was like, that's his business and we don't, that kind of thing. So that's the impression I kind of got sort of just from scratching the surface of what was in the book. But it is really interesting that, because I've seen you mentioned, and you mentioned in the book, that maybe being a part of the UFO community or flying saucer community back then was sort of like the perfect cover because it was like, that was stranger than being gay. That was, but safer. But it was stranger, but safer. It was like, oh, he's just a wild eccentric. And sort of, people kind of, just judge him on that. And he kind of got a pass under the radar for being gay.
Yeah, I think so. David Houchin, who was the longtime curator of the Barker collection, says this in the Shades of Grey documentary from a few years back, that, in a small town, you can only be eccentric for one thing. And so this kind of took over, in his public view. But I think he viewed the gay community and the UFO community as both communities of outsiders that he wanted to be a part of and to kind of guide and help. And so I think that's why they appealed to him. Both of those worlds.
Yeah, and it was really eye-opening when he was arrested and his partner was arrested too, and just eye-opening to see like how kind of crazy, outright crazy, not kind of, they were just crazy laws back then where they were just like, yeah, you're engaging in homosexual acts, and they arrest these guys. And it was just like, wow, this is, things have gotten better, folks. It's like, I know times are tough for everybody right now, but you don't want to be in the 1950s.
Yeah, definitely. And the what records I found from that trial were largely from work that David Houchin had done. So good to mention him again, because he has been a great resource. He knows that collection better than anybody. He is retired now, but he still goes to library events and answers emails when people like me send him questions. So
now another sort of is, you really paint the full picture of Gray Barker with this book. It's how much I loved it. So I have all these different points, like of Barker, the whatever. So Barker, the businessman, that part kind of really fascinated me too. You mentioned at the very, very end. There we go. I'll back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. At the very end of the book, when Keel is sort of remembering Barker, he says he wrung every cent he could out of flying saucers, something like that. But you point out that really wasn't the case. And throughout the book, it seems like he's barely scraping by. He even files for bankruptcy at one point. And this is like as he's kind of also in the movie theater business. So he just wasn't solely a flying saucer guy, but certainly he never got rich off of flying saucers.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that people will try to dismiss Barker or downplay his influence will be to say that, he was just in it for the money. Right. And I don't think that was the case because, he lost more money than he ever made. And if you really look at the kind of expansions and contractions in his publishing business, kind of alongside similar expansions and contractions in the movie business, because he was working for and managing movie theaters for most of his career. What you really see is somebody who, anytime he has two pennies to rub together, he puts them into putting out more UFO books.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a bit more of a kind of addiction model than an exploitation model. That, you know, he tried. There are a couple times when he said, "I'm done with UFO publishing," and then as soon as he was able to afford it, he would go right back to it. So it's kind of a world that he couldn't escape, and maybe didn't want to because it was fun. So.
So maybe you can kind of elucidate a little bit of the mechanics of this in a sense, because it was hard for me necessarily. I got an idea, but it's like it's hard for me to put myself in this space where it was like, so people are getting the newsletters, the Saucerian, and what I loved about it, it was like they're always changing the titles. The things are always everything's very fluid, which I really like, not just with him, but with Bosley and a lot of these other people. It's like, yeah, then this guy came back and now he launched this other zine, and this one's called, the Flying Triangle or whatever. And it was like, this is like the guy's 8th zine, and now it's got a crazy other title. But so people would get these things. They would have the reports and stories that Barker wrote about the things. And then like a little part where it's like you can buy these books that I also sell. And he was like facilitating the publishing. So he had like that wing. That's kind of how it worked, essentially.
Yeah. So Barker started out publishing the Saucerian in 1953, which was started as like a ditto reproduced zine. Didn't really have any advertising to speak of. And then within a couple years, he actually wrote a letter to Morris Jessup, the author of The Case for the UFO and a few other books, saying, well, why don't you and I just start selling books to our correspondents so that we can at least pay for our postage? And so eventually, by the time his first book comes out, he turns the Saucerian into the Saucerian Bulletin, which is like a smaller kind of corner stapled newsletter, rather than like the Saucerian itself had grown to be this massive offset printed publication at that point. So I'm going to try to stick to a better schedule, and I'll just put out a shorter thing. And then that, of course, also starts to grow. But it's around the time that They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers comes out that he starts selling books. And you can see in those early issues of the Saucerian Bulletin, his like list of books he is offering for sale at the back of the bulletin gets longer and longer. Until it eventually is too much. And so he starts having to issue a separate catalog. And then in 1959, he is kind of tired of losing money on other people's books. So he decides, I'm going to, why should I be paying another publisher for stock when I could be the publisher? So that's when he tried to launch his publishing imprint, Saucerian Books. He quickly learns that's not necessarily a way to make money. And that's what leads to his bankruptcy, because he's putting out hardcover books, with dust jackets, kind of nicely produced. And they're not selling in the kind of numbers that he wants, because he's not a book distributor. He has a mailing list of, 1,500 people, but he is not a professional book distributor. And so then we start to see him kind of printing smaller quantities, using cheaper print methods so that he can sell. Well, I can't sell 5,000 books, but I can sell 1,000 books. And so he kind of adjusts his publishing business to match the size of the audience that he had.
Yeah, that was like the really interesting part, sort of following the book, because he's like learning as he goes what will work and what won't, and it's really kind of a fascinating running theme in the book is sort of like his growth as a businessman, his evolution as a publisher, and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work, and trying to cut these deals with people. You point out in the book that it was very clever, where he's like, in the residuals, he's like, I give you 5% of the mail order and 10% of the bookstore sales. And it was like, yeah, the books aren't in fucking bookstores though. but it sounded so great that I'm sure people were like, well, 10% of the bookstore sales, that's great. That's quite a deal. So I really enjoy that little detail of his technique, if you will.
Yeah, that was great. And then another was, there was a kind of arrangement called a subsidy agreement, where basically the author pays the publisher to put out the book instead of, there are no royalties. It's like you're paying to have this book put out. And there are authors where he specifically encourages them not to do this. And then there are authors where he's like, we should do it this way. It's really interesting. I didn't identify a clear pattern as to when he would do that. But then in some cases, one of the people that he explicitly said, you shouldn't do a subsidy agreement, then ended up doing a subsidy agreement with him. So, so he kind of talked them into it by talking it down as an option, I guess.
Now, I'm going to circle back a little bit chronologically. How, it's hard. I mean, big is a sort of nebulous term, but forgive me. How, big in the saucer community was they knew too much about flying saucers? Because it's like this iconic title. But back then, was it like this landmark thing that came out and people were like, this is remarkable what happened to Albert Bender?
Yeah, I think it was pretty big. So one of the kind of active areas of my research right now is looking at that first 6-7 years of UFO book publishing from Donald Kehoe's Flying Saucers Are Real in 1950 through about 1957, 58. And that's kind of the earliest period of there being books about UFOs. And there are only a couple things that qualify as bestsellers in that period. So looking at the New York Times bestseller list as the source for that. So Donald Kehoe had a book on there, and George Adamski's Flying Saucers Have Landed. They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers was not a bestseller, at least at that level, but it did sell through its printing. So I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 printings, but I believe it's, they published about 15,000 copies of it. And that's pretty healthy sales. That last printing did get remaindered, though, and that was one of the kind of most out of the blue, surprising pieces of evidence I turned up in publishing and writing this book. So I was not looking for this, but I was watching the movie Bell, Book, and Candle and saw copies of
you mentioned
They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers on the shelves behind Jimmy Stewart. I was like, what? I had to pause the DVD and squint really close. It's like, yeah, that's They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. There are 6 copies of it, but they're not next to each other. And to me, that indicates the book got remaindered. It was sold they had a bunch of stock of it and they sold it to a set dressing company so that they could put it, you've got to fill a bookshelf in a movie. Here's some books to do it with. But I think of it in a way as kind of the last bestseller of that early period. Again, even though it wasn't a, top 10 bestseller, but it did sell pretty well. But it was really entering this period of diminishing returns in book publishing. You saw a lot of the kind of major hardcover publishers that had been putting out UFO books. You see them canceling projects or just kind of putting out fewer and fewer books. You see the books they had put out turning up in remainder and sale lists, meaning they didn't sell through their editions. And so I think it was pretty big. It was certainly something that people were talking about at the time. You see reviews of it in the saucer zines and even in a couple science fiction magazines. Before the flying saucer topic had been entirely banished from science fiction publishing. That was So I think it was something that was fairly big, but it wasn't big with the general public. The general public was interested in things like the Washington, D.C. sightings. They wanted big, dramatic, lots of people saw this and we don't know what it was. What Barker was doing, and you see him do this throughout his career, was telling stories at the periphery of that subject. So he's not really doing a lot of sighting reports. He's doing things like the Men in Black, the Flatwoods Monster, which is, there is a saucer in that story, but it's not the part that people talk about or remember so much. It's the monster. And similarly with the Mothman. And the Philadelphia experiments kind of even more far afield from UFOs. So the stories that he's telling are ones that are, I want to say closer to Earth, but they're also kind of so far out there and unusual that that's really not the word to use for them. But stories that are going to keep the kind of core of saucer people interested when you don't have a lot of big dramatic sightings to report on. Okay, we can talk about this Men in Black thing. And have you seen anyone in a black suit lately? You probably have in the late 50s. So, so it's stories that are a little bit easier to for people to kind of talk about in the moment and kind of keep going, especially because they're stories that don't have an answer, and so you can kind of speculate on them.
Well, yeah, you make a point, and I can't cite the specific title of the Barker book, but he's talking about Jessup and his mysterious death. And he says in the book, like, I apologize if this book doesn't answer your questions about how Jessup died and the circumstances. Yeah. And you make the point that it's like, and it was kind of like, it's a sort of sly, again, that trickster element where it's like, no, what Barker was seemingly trying to do was to purposely engender these ideas, these questions. It's like, I never set out to answer the mystery. What I actually set out to do is to make you more invested in this mystery, is to hook you on this mystery.
Yeah, and for Barker, if there's an answer to the flying saucer mystery, that's death. That's the end of this project, of this world he's been trying to create and shape. And so, yeah, he's absolutely looking for places where he can hook you on a question that you're not going to find the answer to.
Well, it's interesting because it does seem like the Bender episode, let's say, it does seem like that might have been some kind of like pivot point for Barker where I got the impression he was like a genuine interest in this flying saucer thing where he's like, this is interesting. I'd like to get to the bottom of it. But it seems like after that, he kind of pivots and maybe he didn't like outright say it, but it was kind of like, this is all bullshit. But there's really something here that people love. And I'm going to go in this direction and give the people what they want. And he became less of the nuts and bolts type UFO people that populated much of the scene. You know what I mean? He was kind of like he didn't seem particularly invested in investigating cases per se, UFO cases, flying saucer cases, but oddball, strange cases, sure. It certainly seemed like the act at the core of it, the flying saucer, seemed like he was just kind of like, yeah, I'm all set with trying to figure out the flying saucers because we're not going to figure it out, but there's all kinds of other trouble I can get into with this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, certainly people have said like, well, he believed early on, and then there was a turning point that was related to Bender. And Jim Moseley, who knew him better than anybody, said that. The problem with that is that if you look at the timeline, September 1953 is the first issue of the Saucerian. The Bender thing explodes in October 1953. It's at the beginning. There isn't really a Gray Barker before the Bender story. And if there is, it's for a period of about 9 months to a year when he is part of the International Flying Saucer Bureau's Investigations Committee. But what I think, if you look really closely at a lot of that IFSB correspondence from that year, there's pranksterism going on. So that's where he meets Dom Lucchesi, who he immediately starts doing pranks with. And the self-seriousness of a lot of that IFSB correspondence, to me, looks like, a straight man who is being set up for a punchline. And he, kind of couldn't resist that, I think. So, so I'm a little skeptical of the idea that there was a kind of a before of belief in serious investigation and an after of cynicism.
So maybe so maybe it's even.
I also don't see his after as cynical necessarily, because I think he was he saw it as stories to tell, and I don't think he necessarily didn't see it as stories to tell in that earlier period. I think it was still I think he got a little more experienced about how to tell those stories. But, from the very beginning of his flying saucer investigation, the Flatwoods Monster story, he's already, playing fast and loose with timelines and facts.
Yeah.
And putting little jokes in. There's a line in in that Flatwoods Monster story about somebody who said he was in church that night, which is a Friday night. And in the book, it's written in They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. It's written as, I investigated and couldn't find any churches that held evening services on Fridays. In the original issue of the Saucerian, it's clearly a punchline about the guy being drunk. So yeah, the fact that there were, he was joking from the very beginning. And so I think it was. I don't necessarily see it as having that stark a divide.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so it's almost more instead that like maybe he stumbled upon this scene of serious-minded folks and was like kind of took a piss in a sense of kind of wound them up a little bit. He saw the appeal and wound them up, and then met fellow tricksters who kind of were a bubble within the thing of like serious people.
Yeah. And one thing that's, kind of evidence against the cynicism, I think, and this is kind of what I came to with why he did hoaxes. You do a hoax, it's to send somebody up, it's to take them down a peg. You're going to trick them into believing something, and then you're going to reveal it. Yeah. And he never, ever, ever revealed it. And so the way I see his hoaxes and, his kind of honest reporting is in the same kind of light, that he was giving his audience what they wanted. They're never going to get the perfect UFO photo. They're never going to actually be silenced by the government because they are getting too close to the truth. And so he's going to create and craft that experience for them. And so I see his hoaxes as kind of loving in a way. Where he sees somebody who really wants something from this flying saucer thing that they're not going to get unless they get some help, and he gives them help.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Now this is an odd bit of timing for me personally. So I'm reading the book over the weekend and stopped. At Monday when work starts, I kind of had to take a pause and picked it up again Monday evening, and it was like the spot where I stopped was very jarring. It's sort of talk about transition periods in a sense, because I pick up right where he writes the Silver Bridge, which is to me, it's like it struck me as sort of like his experimental album, if you will. It was like this because I'm reading your recounting of it, and I'm like, is this the same dude? Like, did I miss something? I'm kind of like going back. I'm like, where did I leave off here? Because this guy he's writing an almost psychedelic book about the Mothman case that is just so strange and sort of like this melding of fiction and fact and metaphor and poetry and just strange book. And I'm like, this is so out there. So I guess talk about this book, The Silver Bridge, because it blew my mind.
Yeah, I really do think it's his masterpiece. It is the place where all of the threads of everything he'd been doing since he was a teenager kind of come together, and all around, this weird topic of the Mothman. So it's a book where, so he beats John Keel to the punch by 6 years. So Silver Bridge comes out in 1970. Mothman Prophecies is, I think, 76, might be 75, but in any event, a few years later. But his version, Barker's version of the story is very different. It's told in these little vignettes with this kind of dreamlike prose, where he's focusing not necessarily on, a factual listing of dates and times that things were seen, but really on just capturing an atmosphere or a vibe of like, when you see something weird, what does it do to you? And who are the kinds of people that this thing happens to, and what are the various kind of psychological effects that it can have, and what does your life look like after? And then there are chapters where, there's a chapter told from the point of view of a man in black, which is this weird kind of, I think he might even describe himself as being a two-dimensional figure, that he's kind of this cardboard figure that lives in this world and is trying to interact with it. It's a very strange chapter. But one thing that's really interesting is a lot of the pieces of this story are things that are kind of based on poetry that he had written 8 or 10 years before, right. Or are based on weird little jokes that he had written in letters to Jim Moseley, but nobody else knew about, or pranks that he had pulled on John Keel that John Keel didn't know were pranks yet, and things like that all crop up in this story. And so, yeah, it is a really fascinating and weird book. To say it's about the Mothman is kind of, it's misleading in a way. That's kind of the hook, because that's the context for the various stories that are being told. But what he's really doing is telling a story about paranormal storytelling. Who tells the stories? Who gets to decide what's important in them? And the key chapter in the whole thing is chapter 2, which is called The Recorder. That's about this kind of weird figure that has some supernatural abilities, who arrives in the Ohio River Valley to record what's been going on. And it becomes clear that this figure is a stand-in for Barker, but maybe also for other UFO and paranormal investigators. And that what the recorder is doing is not just recording, but is actually changing and manipulating the events that he witnesses to turn them into something that's going to delight the people of the town below. And I think he's really kind of pulling back the curtain in that chapter to show you, like, this is what I'm doing in this book. This is what I'm doing in my writing and publishing career. But this is what everybody in this UFO world is also doing. And so it's a really, really powerful chapter. First time I read that book, I had no idea what to make of it.
That's how I felt reading your recap. I was, like I said, I was like, what is going on here? What was the reaction to the book? Because to me, it was like, it was so different from just the stuff he was publishing and the stuff that he had written. I just wonder what the sort of contemporaneous response to Gray Barker, who was quite the figure at the time by then, putting out this, like I said earlier, like almost psychedelic book.
It didn't have a huge impact, and I think that that hurt him a bit. I think he really wanted it to. He had tried to sell it to a couple, other publishers, kind of commercial publishers, and they didn't bite. But they didn't know what to make of it. So he, in the solicitation materials, he said, I submitted it to a big publisher, but they wanted to go through, certain sources, trying to make it seem like they needed to vet the information to make sure it was okay. And reading his correspondence, it's clear that what they actually wanted to do was to rewrite the book into something a little more readable, or maybe not readable, but more straightforward. And they wanted it to be a novel. So they were trying to tell him, like, these characters should do this. And they didn't get that it's not a novel, even though it's maybe more of a novel than most books in the UFO world are. But yeah, so they didn't know what to make of it. John Keel didn't like it too much. He made Barker rewrite some parts that were about him personally. And it got reviewed in a couple of the zines, but it didn't make a huge impact. And I think part of it is just because, he was publishing it himself during one of the kind of more kind of contraction-y parts of his publishing career. He didn't put too much else out that year. By this point, so he built up his mailing list in the early 50s with a lot of people who were interested in contactees, who at that time were already skewed older. And so a lot of his mailing list that by 1970 had died off, and he hadn't necessarily replaced them. But it did end up, I think, being influential maybe years and even more so decades later, because it really was a great example of this kind of, what now gets called high strangeness. The meaning of that term has shifted a lot since the early 70s, but it's very much, important work in that kind of subfield, as important as the Mothman prophecies, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I really marveled at it. And I was thinking to myself, like, this is less a book and more like a work of art, what this guy is producing here. It's really quite remarkable. Did he ever, you mentioned in the book, sort of a small thing, but like, so after he wrote this book, and this is how seminal it was, I think, in his eyes, because as you mentioned, he then adopted the hornblower as kind of his logo, which was sort of to stand in for the recorder. Did he ever sort of like, I suppose you don't really explain the joke or whatever, but did he ever go, yeah, I use that because that's how, or is that just to show how important it was?
No, that was entirely my own inference from where that figure appears. And yeah, it's really interesting because once I noticed, because first 30 times I looked at the cover of that book, I didn't even notice the little figure with the horn, let alone know what it meant. And then I'm rereading, that recorder chapter, and he starts conducting the symphony of the horns. I'm like, oh, this guy playing a horn is the recorder. And then I noticed it's on the return address of Gray Barker's newsletter throughout the 70s and 80s. It appears on the fronts of his catalogs in the 70s. Right. But then I noticed it also shows up on his flyers for movies that he was showing at the movie theater he was managing in the 70s. And so it is kind of a symbol that unites all the various parts of his life in a really interesting way.
Yeah, the Barkerverse.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the commercial publishers, how he kind of had this way of, it sort of extends beyond this, where he had a way of sort of taking what might look like bad news and kind of spinning it in a way where it was like it would be palatable to the UFO people, the flying saucer people, as like they're trying to silence this, so you have to get the book from me. But really, it was like, well, no one wants to publish the fucking book, dude. That's really what is going on. But he can't go, I can't find a publisher for my book, so we're gonna do. It's like, oh no, the boys upstairs won't allow us to print this. So you can get it only through my catalog. I thought that was really clever sort of way of appealing to these folks.
Yeah, he was a master of turning lack of interest into signs of something being too close to the truth, which is something you still see in the UFO world, I think. But yeah, he did that repeatedly. So he did it with Howard Venger's book in 1959, with the Silver Bridge in 1970. Anytime, somebody wasn't interested in something he was writing, he was going to turn that into a sign that, well, the truth must be in this one then.
Yeah, exactly. I thought, well, staying in this sort of Mothman realm, I thought it was really interesting and just really kind of like, wow, you look back and you're like, wow, that's quite he was kind of ahead of his time there. And it's funny because even John Keel called him out where Barker had the first Mothman conference, which is, since Mothman has become this massive annual festival.
Right.
Like Barker brought folks to Point Pleasant to celebrate, let's say, Mothman. And Keel was unhappy about this. And he said, you turned it into a tourist event rather than an investigation. And it was like, yes, dude, yes, that's exactly what it did. He was ahead of his time.
Exactly. And that's exactly what it is now, which is fine. It's wonderful. It's great. That is like, Mothman is like the patron monster of Point Pleasant. And yeah, he was there. That was in the 60s that he did the first Mothman festival. And yeah, so a colleague of mine, Joe Laycock, wrote an amazing article for the journal Novo Religio. I think it was Novo Religio, 10, 15 years ago, about the Mothman and the way, the kind of different meanings it's had over the years. Yeah. Beginning as this kind of symbol of terror, then as a symbol of tragedy after the Silver Bridge collapse, and then as a sign of resilience, and then as just kind of as kitsch almost, as a kind of a mascot for the town. And all of these
now, and this has really become a West Virginia icon. It's really pretty remarkable.
And then you see their efforts elsewhere to kind of get their own monster. So the Flatwoods Monster Museum, which is a wonderful place to visit, but was formerly the Braxton County Visitor Center. But now as a museum for Flatwoods Monster, and they started having in Grafton, West Virginia, a Grafton Monster Festival, which is a story that Barker wrote up but never published. He had there are notes in the archive towards an article on the Grafton Monster that never actually appeared anywhere. Which is why I don't mention it in the book, because I actually didn't realize that it was going to be important, but to the town of Grafton, it now is. So,
well, I mean, I wonder, because I've visited West Virginia just once and fell in love with the place and would love to settle there someday. I feel like I'm going to retire there. People have heard me say this a million times on the show, because it's a beautiful state, and it's got this magical element to it. And I do wonder how much that is owed to Barker both the Mothman and the Flatwoods Monster, and him being a West Virginia guy. Like, I just wonder if a lot of sort of the zeal, a lot of sort of the energy that's behind these things can really be traced back to someone right there in the state, also sort of boosting them and getting them up to like iconic case sort of status, because
I think to a certain extent it runs the other way, because there is a rich tradition of storytelling in Appalachia that Barker is really drawing on in his writing. That he was so good at telling stories because he had been told so many good ghost stories growing up, and so I think that's a big part of it. But then because he was working in this kind of arena where he had what became a national platform to kind of get these stories out to people who aren't just gathered around the campfire in Braxton County, but are in cities of the East and West Coast and everywhere in between. That he kind of broadcasts a lot of that folklore and that storytelling tradition to elsewhere. So I think he does become a bit of a draw, or a reason for there being a draw. But the storytelling tradition has been there all along.
Right. I guess in a sense, what I mean is like part of the reason why they're remembered, and maybe like the Van Meter mystery. There's a creature that just kind of came along, but it was like a century old. But it was like, but you had Barker there to kind of like boost this up. Like if he had lived in Ohio, maybe some of these other localized crazy stories would be the iconic ones that we know today.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, he's definitely
talk a little
amplifier.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about one of the interesting things was how, and you mentioned it a few moments ago, sort of like how Barker and Mosley and the scene at the time, they grew out of the contactee period, but they had to like navigate. That died out, and the Condon thing kind of crushed flying saucers for a while, and then it kind of made a comeback. But I guess talk about how they navigated all this, because it did seem like when the contactee fad was over, they kind of were like, oh, what are we going to do now? Like, people don't want this stuff anymore.
Yeah. Well, so one thing that's interesting is that when the kind of abduction stories are kind of first really getting traction, a little bit in the 60s and more so in the 70s, you see people like Barker and Mosley who will refer to them as contact stories. Even in Shockingly Close to the Truth, I think Mosley refers to Betty Hill as a contactee. Wow. But if you look at the kind of arc of her life and kind of the way that she talked about the beings she had encountered, especially later in her life, she sounds like a contactee from the 50s. She's talking about how friendly, the friendly aliens and how they help her. And she can take you down the street and show you a UFO right now if you want to see it. Yeah. It's very similar to the way somebody like Howard Menger talked in the 50s and 60s. And you do see Barker, through into the 80s, kind of publicizing new stories that really are contact stories, but he's trying to kind of place them in the context or put flavor on them that's similar to stories that were kind of catching the ufological eye in that period. So the abduction stories. On the one hand, you kind of see him at his grumpiest in some of this. So like he wrote a long editorial in the 70s on Travis Walton case, where it's the closest that he's ever sounded to, kind of Donald Menzel style skeptic. So you see a bit of grumpiness emerging around that, but then you kind of see him trying to like hold on to his place and as somebody who had been, really primary channel for contact stories. These stories that are interesting to you, these abduction stories, are, just a different flavor of the thing that I've been doing all along. I think that is an interesting overlap. But if you look at a lot of the abductee stories from the 70s and 80s, they do have a lot of contactee flavor. It's just they've been injected with just enough weirdness to seem, alien enough to be plausible, kind of. But that weirdness is the kind of thing that we see Barker doing in The Silver Bridge. That flavor of weirdness is something that Barker had also had like a big hand in the 70s, especially.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I can see some of Barker in a sense. I don't know how much you follow contemporaneous UFO stuff, but it's like there's been a sea change where all the fans and all the researchers have either died out or kind of been pushed to the side since 2017 with this new era of UFOs. And it's like I imagine it was very much like that with the contactee thing and sort of the change in times where guys like Barker and Mosley and other people were like, look, we were around because there are people now who are saying this, like, hey, we've been around for the last 20, 30 years. We've been doing and they've all of a sudden been cast aside by the new flavor of the month sort of ideas and people that sort of all of a sudden slide into the forefront of the field.
Yeah, it is similar. And one of the things that Barker was doing in the 70s and 80s was kind of trying to point back and say, like, this stuff, this is what these stories have been here all along. They just used to look like this. And that's definitely something that you see with some of the more recent stories that have been presented to the public that are just different retellings of stories that go back 30, 40, 50 years presented as being new and exciting and the new thing, but the people who really know the history can say, like, oh, well, this originates back in the pages of the Saucerian Bulletin in 1962, something like that. So
right, exactly. Yeah. Aaron Gullius and I have sort of talked about this before in the past. Yeah, these stories, like what Barker laid down, Men in Black and Philadelphia Experiment, he really pushed hard and everything. So it's like he seeded this stuff, and then it got picked up by other people, and sort of it evolves over time and changes. But people don't realize that the core, the root of it all, eventually it just becomes sort of a runaway train of a story.
Yeah. And I use a couple of points in the book the metaphor of mutation because I think it really is, it kind of grows biologically. The thing that's different is that mutation, genetically happens at random. In the UFO world, you very often have kind of canny operators who are deliberately changing what the story is to kind of push it in a particular direction. So Barker was one of those. I don't think he had too much of an agenda beyond keeping people interested. In the 80s and 90s, you have people with very specific political agendas who start kind of twisting these stories for their ends. And so, yeah, it is, but it's something that if you know what the ingredients are, or if you kind of break the stories apart, you can see what the ingredients are and trace them back. And I think that's something that's definitely something that people interested in this should do.
I got just a handful of little points left for you before we wrap it up. One thing I found interesting, I don't know how much we kind of talked about the business end of things, but maybe what I thought was just kind of cool and interesting and funny was like Barker, he sells the newsletter to Mosley. Yeah. And then down the line, Mosley sells it back to him. And then later he sells it to Ray Palmer. And it's like, this is nowadays somebody has a podcast or whatever, they like shut it down. They don't do anything. But like back then, I guess the mailing list was quite important. So you could sell this stuff. But it was really interesting. Just this, it's like a baby being passed along to each different person. And there's like a lineage you can follow that, all right, then it was this guy and then it was that guy. He owned it. And then, so it's really it's interesting and fun.
Well, the reason they do that is financial. So if basically Barker had accepted subscription payments from people, and, it'd be like, you pay me $2 for 6 issues. The idea being it comes out quarterly and, every year and a half, you'll get another $2, but he never stuck to his schedule. So it would turn out maybe it'd be 6 or 7 years before he had 6 issues out. So when you close your zine, if you aren't going to fulfill those subscriptions, you need to give people their money back.
Right.
So it's much easier to find somebody who will buy your subscription list. Yeah. And then, you will fulfill, your subscription to the Saucerian Bulletin will now be fulfilled by 3 additional issues of Saucer News. Right. If that person is already on your mailing list, then it just extends their subscription by 3 years. But if not, you've just added 300 subscribers that you didn't have before. And, hopefully they like what you're putting out. And if not, well, too bad.
I thought it was interesting that Mosley said when he bought Barker's newsletter that he doubled his subscribers from like 2,000 to 4,000, which is remarkable when you really, that there were 4,000 people out there who were interested in this stuff. Just at the time.
Yeah. And I think, by the end of Saucer News, I think they had the biggest subscription list, in the entire field, maybe the exception of Nightcap's newsletter, because, there were a lot of Nightcap members at that point.
Yeah.
But they had their own financial problems, which John Keel actually detailed in an article for Saucer News in the 60s. But yeah, the lineage is interesting, and seeing where, who are you going to sell to? It should be somebody that's you're aligned with in some way, that you're not, you're not going to sell it to somebody who's, publishing something, entirely different. It's got to be something where the subscribers are going to kind of understand why it's, being finished with this. But the fact that it ends up with Saucer News, which had started as, a really cheaply produced, zine, and an edition of maybe 25 or 50 copies, I think, for the first issue of Nexus. Then ultimately being sold to Ray Palmer, who was the only national newsstand magazine on flying saucers in the 50s. That just kind of shows how far it came from, in the science fiction fandom world, there's, zines, there's semi-pro zines, and there's pro zines. And it's really tough to climb that ladder, but Saucer News did it. So.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot in the book there. It's interesting to me too. We won't get into it here this afternoon, but the sort of how the flying saucer field kind of like burst, or I don't know how you describe it, kind of like schismed out of science fiction, and how there was that sort of backlash where people who were into the science fiction were like, we don't want any of this mumbo jumbo stuff. And it was like, it's really, it's remarkable. Like, that's how far back that the UFO and science fiction fields, they're like mortal enemies. And that's something else I've been researching recently, is the way the kind, because really those worlds are mutually exclusive by like the early 60s, certainly. But they kind of obscured the fact that back in the late 40s, early 50s, there had been a lot of overlap and interaction between them. And so that's an area that I'm looking at right now too. That they did kind of grow from the same soil, even if they didn't want you to think that by the later period. Yeah. It's a fascinating sort of evolution there. Now, one completely ridiculous thing that stood out to me in the book that I wanted to ask you about was, so Barker, he's working the drive-ins. He's sort of, managing or whatever the drive-ins. He's sort of the go-between, getting it all set up.
A few different hats, but he would select what they were going to show, but for some of them he really did just run the theater for the.
Right. He's almost like a consultant or something. I couldn't quite like wrap my mind around it. But at some point, I don't know if it was because business was dropping or something. It said they started showing pornography and adult films at drive-ins, which I was like, what? That doesn't even, first of all, that sounds kind of gross. That sounds kind of creepy. Like, we're all going to get in the bar, we're all going to get in the field in our cars and watch porn together. That's crazy.
I thought that was really surprising, but this was an actual development that took place, in not just Barker's drive-ins, but nationwide. That they did start showing, nudist pictures. It's pornography has changed over the years. It seemed probably pretty tame by today's standards for the most part. But that they would start to show this, and it was kind of I think at one point even draw a similarity between what was happening with flying saucers and what was happening with drive-in movie theaters, because they were also like second-class citizens in the movie world. They couldn't necessarily get a movie from like Universal. Because they wanted it to show in real movie theaters, and so they only had access to this kind of second and third tier content, and that's the same thing that happened when with saucer sightings. During slow periods, it's like you don't have a great Washington D.C. sighting to report on. You might have to go with this weird contact story or or something like that. So it's the same thing that happened across both.
Interesting. Now, super obscure thing that I was thinking as I was reading the book. So Barker, he's selling Ted Owens books. These are like this is sort of like the Easter eggs. These are like the Easter eggs for the folks who've already read Saucerian. So he's selling Ted Owens books. And with the books comes these things called SI discs. Are there any of these discs floating around anywhere? Was there one in the archive, or do we know anyone who has one?
I have seen one, and it's in the archive. And it's in the archive because somebody said, so basically this is like a good luck charm, essentially. So Ted Owens was like a psychic contactee who said he had all kinds of amazing abilities. He could direct hurricanes and cause lightning strikes. And he could charge things with positive energy that would make good things happen for you. So he produced these plastic discs that he would charge with energy from the space people, and then good things would happen to you if you had them. And the one that's in the archive is taped to a letter where someone has mailed it back saying, "Since I got this, I have had only bad luck."
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so I would love to own one personally, frankly.
If
anybody has got a line on any, but yeah, they were sold. I found the records about how they produced them. It was like there was a company that would produce promotional items. So like you work for a car company and you want to give away for the convention coming up, and you would like print a little plastic thing and hand it out. So they were super cheap to produce. So Ted Owens had actually produced some of his own, and then Barker funded the production of another run that are the ones that he distributed. But there's a little bit of indication that he might have gotten in trouble, or at least worried he was going to get in trouble with, I guess maybe the FDA. Because if he's sending a solicitation letter out saying like, if you give me $1 for this disc, like you will find $1,000, in a bag on the side of the road, is he promising something that he can't deliver? And I found a little bit of evidence about an actual FDA investigation into something else. But then following that investigation, he starts writing letters being like, is it okay that I'm doing this?
Yeah. Well, someday I'm going to make my way down to that archive, and that'll probably be the first thing I want to see is the little disc, because it just seemed like, just a weird sort of like thing that I guess I'm right in a sense that I imagined was there were none left, and maybe one there. That we have one. Yeah, that's amazing.
They're just little like 1-inch plastic discs. So like if your uncle had one and he died and you were cleaning out his apartment, you would not keep this thing. You would toss it in the trash.
Right.
So,
yes.
It's just like a red disc with like a little lightning bolt symbol on it. Basically, it doesn't look like anything. It doesn't describe what it is. It's just a little. Looks like a little piece of junk. So I don't think too many of them have survived. And the ones that have survived, I don't think there are that many people who know what they are. And that's really the problem. It's like you can look for it, on eBay or whatever, but like you have to trust that the person who has one knows what it's called. So,
right, yeah, and given the scarcity, if someone listening to this right now, they look in their home library, then they'll probably put it on eBay for too much money. So we've gone through Barker's life here on the show. One last note on his passing, it just struck me as interesting. Well, the way you wrote it, like it's at the end of a paragraph. It's not this moment. It's sort of like, it kind of felt almost like a little bit of a whimper in a sense. It was like a paragraph where he was not feeling well, and then he died. And I kind of did a double take where I'm like, wait a minute, did he just die? It wasn't a thunderous moment when he passed away. It was like, he's here, he went to the hospital, then he came back from the hospital, then he went back one last time, and then he died. And it was like, and it kind of, but it was poetic and perfect the way you wrote it, because it captured Barker in a sense, at least as I saw him from the book, where it was like he was a big fish in a weird pond.
Yeah.
And it was like I'm willing to bet, I presume, that there wasn't like a New York Times obituary or anything like that. It was just like, to the people in the community, it was like, whoa, Ray Barker died.
Yeah.
But to the outside world, it was, they don't know. They didn't know this massively significant figure had passed away.
Yeah. There were obituaries for him in a couple places, but it was UFO zines. So the first big one was in Saucer Smear. Jim Moseley wrote an obituary for him that opens with the line, which I quote in the book, Gray Barker should have lived forever, but he didn't. which I think is a great and sad line. That was within days of Barker dying that Moseley had that out. And then UFO Review, edited by Timothy Green Beckley, which Barker had been writing a revived Chasing the Flying Saucers column for a couple of years, published a kind of tribute to Gray Barker, a month or two later, with people writing kind of their remembrances of him, and things like that. But yeah, you're right. He was a weird fish in a small pond, and he didn't. Not a lot of people, were aware or cared. That this kind of guy from this weird UFO world was no longer with us. But yeah, it was his illness came up pretty suddenly, and I don't think he or anybody else knew how serious it was going to be. But he was sick through the fall. And one of the reasons it happened so quickly is, he's not writing any letters when he's in the hospital. So like, there's just not a lot of documentation of
right. Yeah.
So,
yeah. It's just very interesting. It's like he made an enormous impact on pop culture in the world with the Men in Black and all this other stuff. And it's just, very often sort of the creator, there's some kind of thing out there, some kind of axiom or something that it's always like the second person gets the credit or something.
Yeah.
It's like the person who says like who points it out or whatever gets it, but it's like someone else who was really responsible for it. I don't know.
Yeah,
I butchered that axiom, but it's out there. I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I guess with all that said, what's next for you? I mean, I say this as someone who loves the flying saucer world and the UFO community. I would love it if you would stay with us and just write UFO books. But you seem like a very nice man, so I would not wish that fate upon you. So what is next for you?
Well, I'm not quite done with Gray Barker yet. So this book started as a bibliography. It was just going to be about the books that Barker published. And my bibliography ended up becoming an appendix to the book that then was so long that it got cut. But I am planning to publish that separately. So it'll be very tightly focused on the books, but it'll be a bit of a kind of book historical and kind of collector's guide to Saucerian publications. And I'm hoping that'll be out within the next year and a half. There's another Barker project that I'm not quite ready to talk about in public yet that I'm equally excited about, that may appear even a little bit earlier if I can get all the I's dotted and T's crossed. So stay tuned for that. And then I'm still doing research on the UFO and science fiction communities. I've got a kind of cryptozoology project that I'm working on about
all right,
the narrative structure of cryptozoological writing. So these are things that'll, I'm doing conference presentations. Some of them will turn into chapters in books or journal articles or something. But don't have any other book projects, apart from the bibliography, on deck at the moment. But I will remain interested in weird stuff and the culture surrounding it for sure. So
nice. So we'll hear more from you in the future.
Yes,
I like that. That's good news. Gabriel, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. I hope that I did justice to the book. I wanted to cover the real expanse of what you put together in the Saucerian. It is absolutely outstanding. The Binnall of America listeners, especially the ones who've been on this ride for a long time, I have a feeling many of you already have gotten the book. If you haven't gotten the book yet, get it. You will absolutely love it. It is outstanding. As I said at the beginning, it's a real tour de force, and it's a fun ride. And that's, I think, I really want to emphasize again. That's what it was. Gray Barker, there was a whimsy about him, and it comes through in the book. And I found an unsettling number of parallels between myself and Barker there, especially at the end, where it's like, I think someone's like, he died of smoking and drinking too much. I was like, oh shit, I need to take a look at my life. But the book is absolutely tremendous, and I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. And my hat's off to you, man. Thank you for writing this. It's awesome.
Yeah, thanks for reading it. Thanks for having me on, and glad you enjoyed it.